All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon, which is on the basics of the CSBG Organizational Standards. I'm Mary Beth Schnaber-Remrev. I'm the Director of Organizational Capacity Building here at the National Community Action Partnership. So one of the things in my portfolio includes the CSBG Organizational Standards. Always a great topic to talk about, an evergreen topic. And I see a few folks in the chat saying that you are new, so you're very grateful to have this primer. And, you know, the org standards, there's 58 of them, so in no way are we going to go through those 58 standards. This is really just going to be an overview of what they are, a few kinds of tips and tricks in general for how you can look at them and read them and think about them. I'll share some tools and resources with you as well. And if you're just joining us, we would love if you would say hello in the chat. Tell us who you are, what agency you're with, anything else you want us to know for the meeting today. Also, as we go, if you have questions, if you have thoughts, I welcome you to put it in the chat. I will do my best to keep an eye on it as I'm covering our content and try to be responsive to you in this format. We are in webinar mode, but if you have questions, you can put it in the chat to me or to everybody. So with that, I want to start by grounding us in the promise of community action. And that promise reads that community action changes people's lives, embodies a spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. This promise of community action, you know, there's 1,000 community action agencies coast to coast, over 1,000 technically, and we are united in purpose in service to this mission, no matter where we are in the country. And so if you're here and you're going, well, why are we talking about org standards? These have been around for a little while. Why are we talking about these and why are we talking about them now? Well, a couple of reasons. One, the organizational standards, as I was just saying, it's kind of an evergreen topic because we always have new folks who are coming in, whether that be at a local agency or at a state office, and kind of our understanding of the standards over time, you know, may shift a little bit as we learn more about the standards. We might have new questions. So, you know, that's one of the reasons why we're talking about this and why we're talking about it right now. Also do want to flag for everybody that the recording and slides from today, we are going to post those to the NCAP website in just a couple of days. So keep your eyes peeled for that. If you need to revisit these materials, you will find them on the NCAP website. So, okay, so let's dive in. And you might be saying, well, gosh, this doesn't look like the org standards that's up on my screen, but I feel like it's important to start with who we are as a network to fundamentally understand why organizational standards are so important to who we are. So community action agencies, as I said, over 1,000 community action agencies coast to coast. Every agency looks a little bit different. No two agencies are exactly alike. We have all different kinds of programs and funding. Very few agencies have only CSBG, but regardless of that, as a network, we are a national movement that is seeking to address those causes and conditions of poverty. And as a movement, we developed this theory of change that you see before you. And essentially, this theory of change articulates the work that we do, the change that we're trying to create, and some of the philosophy behind why we do what we do. The services, you know, why do we pick the services and strategies that we pick? You know, what are our core principles that are driving the decisions that we make to create change? And so this theory of change was developed, as I said, with the network several years ago, maybe about 10 years ago now. And I'll go through this pretty quickly here. Across the top there in that first row, you see that we have 3 national goals that we believe all community action agencies are working towards. You may not be working towards all 3, but at least one of these should sound like something like what you're doing. The first goal is that individuals and families with low incomes are stable and achieve economic security. Goal 2 is about communities where people with low incomes live are healthy and offer economic opportunity. And then our third national goal speaks to the fact that people with low incomes are engaged and active in building opportunities in communities. As I said, I hope that you see the work of your agency in at least one of those goals, and you may see it in more than one too. I'm actually going to go back down to the bottom now, so follow along with me. To get to those goals, which are kind of up in the sky, right? We have a strong foundation. We start from this foundation where we have a national network of over 1,000 high-performing community action agencies, state associations, state offices, federal partners, national partners, who are all supported in one way or another by the Community Services Block Grant to mobilize communities to fight poverty. As I said, very rare for an agency to only receive Community Services Block Grant funding, but all that's kind of the tie that binds us is our CSBG funding. And then we have some core principles that articulate how we approach the work as a community action agency, some of the things that we deeply believe. So let's see if these check out to you. We recognize that poverty is complex. There's not, a magic solution to poverty. It's multifaceted, right? We also believe deeply in building local solutions specific to local needs. That goes all the way back to the founding of community action in 1964. We believe that it is not enough to provide individual services in order to address poverty, that there are larger systems at play that have to be addressed in order for people to be able to achieve those goals that you see at the top, right? We have to be thinking about the larger forces in people's lives as well. That we have to look then at both individual and family level change as well as community level change to that end. That we have to maximize the involvement of people who experience poverty, right, to ensure that our strategies are effective, and that we have to leverage a number of different resources in order for us to be effective. And then those core principles guide us in the selection of a suite of services and strategies. And some of those principles show up in that, right? The recognition that poverty is complex shows up in the fact that we have lots of different services and strategies listed here, right? We don't just have one, we have lots of different options, right? Poverty is complex, so our services and strategies need to be complex and broad and meet people where they are. That also gets into building local solutions specific to local needs, because maybe in my community, we have a really strong employment network, and maybe not in your community, right? Or maybe we have a really strong education system and maybe not in your community. And so you can best pick the services and strategies that reflect the needs of your local community. So, and then you see, again, those services and strategies that we hope move us towards those broader national goals, okay? So now you might be saying, Mary Beth, you're missing a whole box on this chart, but I am not, I promise. Here's the other thing about community action. From our founding, we have believed in that it is essential to be accountable for the work, and not just accountable to funders, right? But accountable to ourselves, accountable to the movement, accountable to the communities that we serve. And so we ask ourselves some very key questions. We ask ourselves about how well are we operating and what difference are we making, right? And so that's here in this little box here. And just to kind of zoom you in there, essentially, we want to make sure that we are both effective and efficient in our work. And so over here, and what difference did we make? We track what kinds of differences we're making with folks by counting or using our national performance indicators. So you'll hear that term. For those of you new to community action, you might hear NPI or an FNPI, which is a family level national performance indicator, or a CNPI, a community level national performance indicator that we report via the CSBG annual report, which reports on all of the change a community action agency creates regardless of its funding source. So that's how we track what difference we're actually making, right? How many people get a job? How many kids are reading at grade level? How many seniors are living independently? The list can go on and on. But we don't only care about that. We do also care about how well are we operating as a network? How are we ensuring that we're doing good work when we're doing the good work? And so, one of the ways that we ensure that is through the results-oriented management and accountability system, ROMA, as it is called. And so Roma is our business management system that basically helps us to ensure that we're constantly, assessing, what are the needs, making good plans, implementing high quality services, tracking results, and then evaluating how well did we do at all of that to then feed back into that same process all over again, right? We also have some state and federal accountability measures, recognizing that the community services block grant funnels down from the feds to states to us at the local level. That those systems have to be accountable to us as network members, and as well as ensuring that we have accountability to our communities. And then we also have the local organizational standards. And these local organizational standards, the CSBG organizational standards, help us to understand how well we are operating and ensure that community action agencies have the capacity that is necessary in order to be able to address the needs of their local communities, right? To be good stewards of the community services block grant dollars. And so the CSBG organizational standards were developed, in the early 20 teens, and implemented kind of in the late 20 teens. And they were developed in partnership with the Community Action Network. So a really key piece I want you to walk away with from this is that the standards were not developed just by the feds, right? This was actually a very collaborative process between local agencies, states, and the federal office to ultimately determine what are the basic capacities that an agency needs to be called a community action agency? What is a minimum level of quality that we need coast to coast for you to be a member of this network, right? So within the organizational standards, then you will see some very direct links between some of the laws, some of the rules we have to follow. So things like from the CSBG Act itself, from the Community Services Block Grant Act itself. Some of the standards have a direct tie back to that act. Some of our standards come from OMB uniform guidance, right? Things that we know that we have to do when we spend federal money. Some of the org standards link to other federal laws and regulations, particularly when you get into like HR, finance kind of stuff. But then there are things, guys, that are just good management, right? We know from years of nonprofit administration that there is just good management practice that we know leads to effective organizations. You will see some of that within the standards themselves too. And then also, very important, are also the values of community action. I just shared with you some of our core principles. Those core principles show up in the standards themselves because it's very important to us to maintain our value-based system, right? So if you go to look for the CSBG organizational standards, you will find that they are established in the Community Services Block Grant Information Memorandum 138. Now, if you're going, what the heck is a CSBG Information Memorandum or CSBG IM? It is essentially where our federal office provides us legal guidance to the network, right? They basically let us know kind of how they interpret the law and some of its requirements. So the CSBG Act itself was last reauthorized in 1998. CSBG organizational standards didn't really come out. You can see this IM is dated fiscal year 2015, and I think they actually came out in 2016 and put into place in 2017. So my point here is if you go to the Act itself, you're not going to see where organizational standards are required. Because it was passed before org standards came out. However, CSBG organizational standards are required for all CAAs. States are required to assess that agencies are complying with the organizational standards on that annual basis. So you can always go to CSBG IM 138 to see where those requirements. The org standards themselves are divided into 3 thematic groups. There are 9 categories, 58 standards for private CAAs. There are also standards specific for public CAAs. So public CAAs, you have a few fewer standards. You don't have any standards that are in addition to anything, but also just some of the standards are worded a little bit different for a public community action agency, just recognizing that what's within a public CAA's control is very different than a private CAA. And if you're not sure which one you are, a private CAA is typically a 501c3 organization run by a governing board, and a public CAA is typically in a unit of local government. And so a lot of times the government is making a lot of the decisions, or your city council is technically your board, although you do have to have an administering board who kind of guides CSBG programming specifically. Anyway, back to our regularly scheduled programming here. The org standards, you can see we have those 9 categories. About consumer input and involvement, community engagement, and community assessment. In the vision and direction bucket, you see we have org leadership, board governance, and strategic planning. And then in the operations and accountability bucket, you see human resource management, financial operations, and oversight, and data and analysis. What else did I want to tell you about this? Even though the CSBG organizational standards are called the CSBG organizational standards, many times the requirements that fall within here have to do with how your agency as a whole operates versus just CSBG funding. The exception to that would be, again, a public CAA. And if you're not sure kind of where the bounds of your public CAA are, a really good place to start is where your board has oversight, where your governing board has oversight. So just kind of a few technical notes for you there. Guys, as I'm talking, if you have questions, would love to see them in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on that. I don't see that anything has come in just yet, so I think we're okay so far. All right, so here are a few points for you about the org standards in general. We talked about they were developed by the network for the Community Action Network. They're meant to ensure that we have a minimum level of capacity or quality in order to be considered a member or eligible for CSBG funding. The standards themselves, if y'all have ever read the standards, sometimes you'll go, gosh, well, that's pretty broad. And that is intentional, because with a network of 1,000 agencies, each CAA might need to implement the standards a little bit different, right? When it comes to board reporting, for instance, we don't want to set kind of a national standard for what a board report has to look like. That's really a determination that is up to you and your local, for the local agency to make with its board. That's a local decision, not a national decision. And you'll also note that there are typically not specific documentation or processes that are articulated within the standards themselves, right? Because again, they have to be broad enough to be flexible to meet the needs of 1,000 different agencies. So with that though, because CSBG is a block grant, essentially, the feds don't come out and monitor a CAA for compliance with the organizational standards. That is the state's responsibility, because they are the ones who receive the funding, and then they put the specific rules in place for how that funding is to be administered within the state, right? And so states assess an agency's compliance. They're required to do that on an annual basis. So your state is not being mean if they're coming out every year. They are required to do that. And states are either marking standards as met or not met. There is no such thing as kind of partial credit, if you will, for an agency. But this gets into a very important point for folks to understand when it comes to the standards, is that because every state is in charge of assessing the standards, how states interpret standards can look a little bit different, just depending across state lines. And so it's very important that agencies, if you ever have questions about what a standard means or what kind of documentation might be required, you're going to have to go to your state office to figure out what you need to do. You should always look to your state guidance first, because they are the ones who are going to assess if you're compliant or not with a given standard. A lot of that information is available on their website, or if you don't have it, just contact your CSBG state office administrator and they'll be able to give you that information. And then kind of a maybe a controversial statement. I love saying controversial statements on recorded webinars, is that CSBG org standards, when it comes to them, the standards are looking to see that a practice is in place or that, that an item exists, not necessarily its level of quality, right? So let me give you an example. The org standards say you have to have a community assessment. A community assessment can look very, very different and still check the box of being a community assessment. Same thing could be said about a risk assessment. Same thing could be said about a lot of the board stuff, right? You could be meeting all of the board organizational standards and still, have some room to improve, right? The standards are the minimum threshold. They are not excellence. They are not top quality. It's basically ensuring that you have those minimum thresholds in place, which brings me to my next point. It's very important that that agencies, as you're thinking about the standards, that, there's a piece of this that's like, yes, we want to be able to say that we have met the org standard. You want to check the box, right? But I really encourage you that as you read the standards, that you take time to consider what is the standard, what is the practice that the standard is saying to do, why is that important, and what is the intent? And that you can really fully live into the intent of the standard, right? That you can do the best of the best. Look at best practices for a community assessment or a risk assessment or board engagement or whatever that may be, or board reporting, for your agency to be the best that it can be. You can also look to things like the community action standards of excellence for kind of further guidance about what it would mean to go beyond just compliance. States, this is something else for you to consider if I have any state offices on the call, that, when you're assessing org standards, you're really looking to make sure that the basics are met, that folks have done what they need to do. You might offer some suggestions for how things can be improved, but ultimately, if the item is there, if the agency has done what's required, then they have essentially met the functional requirements of the standard, that then they're really in a met category versus a not met category. We all have room to improve and grow, but org standards are that minimum threshold, okay? Okay. I don't see anybody throwing tomatoes just yet, which is fabulous. I do see a question in the chat about a specific standard. And so we'll come back to that. I'll need to look up that standard and put it in front of my eyes because I don't have them all memorized by heart just yet, believe it or not. Okay, so I have another thing I want to make sure I tell folks on the call. The org standards are bigger than one person or role in the agency. So it is not one person's job to ensure that the org standards are all done, right? You might have one person who is in charge of coordinating the org standards or coordinating with other people to be sure that all the requirements are met. But because the org standards apply to so much of your agency, there's no way one person can do all of that, right? So it's very good and a good risk practice to ensure that there are multiple folks engaged in the org standards, that they understand the org standards and their requirements. And again, you might have that kind of central person, that taskmaster, who will keep the trains on track, keep track of everything for us. But it is not just one person's job. We all collectively own our responsibility to ensuring that we are meeting the organizational standards. So a couple of tips for you then that I want to go into on the standards themselves. So I'm going to talk first about, like, when you read the standards, how can you ensure that you're understanding them? First is to, when you read the standards, start by identifying what is the standard actually asking me to do? What is the required action I have to take? There are times that sometimes, when folks read the standard, they read additional requirements that aren't actually there. Pay very close attention to the words and what they're telling you you have to do. Make sure you're not reading into anything else beyond what the standard says. And so if you're not sure what it says, first reflect on what is the intent, right? Go back to what was the purpose of this? Why is this important to a community action agency? And then always clarify questions about the definition, the intent, and the documentation requirements with your state CSBG office. Again, they're the ones who are going to determine if that standard is met or not met. So their interpretation is what you need to make sure that you are understanding. And then one other recommendation is that, you read the standards in context and as a whole. And that is to say that there are some standards that will actually kind of cross categories. So like community assessment is a really good example, that there are some aspects of a community assessment or requirements that might tie to your community assessment that actually aren't all in that community assessment bucket, because community assessment is very broad reaching, right? Same thing can be said for many of the board standards. If you only read the board standards as a category, you would miss a lot of the requirements. So it's very important that you're aware of kind of the other requirements and where they sit within the organizational standards. There are a number of dependencies. So I want to pause here then, because I do see some further follow-up about the organizational standard in question. So somebody is asking that organizational standard 4.6 is very broad, and particularly for public community action agencies, and that has created some challenges with their state office. So, and that is the standard that pertains to risk assessment. And if I am remembering correctly, and as I pull this up, that standard says something along the lines of that a public CAA has to comply with the public entities' requirements around risk assessment, that it's not likely that the public CAA itself has done its own risk assessment, because there are broader risk assessment rules and regulations. And if I could see everyone, I could see if you were nodding along with me, but I can't quite tell. So this feels like a good time, though, to bring up that if you have specific questions about that interpretation, it's very good to have that conversation directly with your state office. Yes, the department complies with the local government's risk assessment policies and procedures. So, how you can tackle this. One of the ways that you can tackle this, whether it's this standard or other standards, you can start by reading the standard together with your state office, right? And then asking them what they think it requires. What does that mean that we, comply with the state's, or comply with the local government's requirements? And then from there, ask, what kind of documentation am I going to have to show you? Am I going to have to show you so that we can agree that we are meeting this standard? So in this case, you have to show that you're complying with that requirement. Well, who can say if you're complying with that requirement? That's probably your local government, right? Because it's a local policy. It's not a state policy. It's a local policy. And so when I used to work at a public CAA, and how I tackled this is I reached out to our contracts department, or our kind of compliance department, if you will, and I asked them for a statement about what the policy was and to affirm if we were doing what we needed to do to meet that requirement. They would provide that to us, we would provide that to the state, and that was plenty enough. So that's one thing that you could do. If you're having ongoing conversations with your state office and you're, kind of having some trouble getting to alignment or agreement, would recommend that you engage your state association as well. And honestly, whenever you get interpretation from the state about org standards, it's always a good idea to let your state association know, because there might be other folks in your state who have the same question or the same challenge, and getting that interpretation out to everybody can be very helpful. There are also times where, look, sometimes, really honest mistakes happen. How folks are interpreting it might be not kind of accurate for where we are. There might be history behind why it's interpreted a certain way. So always good to kind of have that broader conversation with others in your network. Okay, I hope that that helped. But if you have further questions on any of that, please do reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk org standards. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Guys, keep questions coming. Happy to address questions as they come up. So then I have a few tips for you about implementing the standards, right? So first you have to understand what the heck the standards are. What do they say? What do you have to do? And then for implementing your org standards, the first thing I would recommend that you do is that you build any kinds of requirements into just how your agency does its work, into your agency operations or your standard operating procedures. So for instance, there are a lot of requirements for community assessment, right? So if you have kind of a guide for how to do your community assessment, just build that into your guide, right? So that next year, in case you're not the person sitting in that seat doing the community assessment, maybe you won the lottery. If you did, please remember how wonderful the Community Action Network was. But truly, if you're not in that seat, you want to make sure that the next person knows and understands what's required, right? And so build it into your processes wherever you can, just build it into policy. Another recommendation that we have is that you document the standards as they occur, because you assess, because your state assesses that you're compliant on an annual basis. Well, gosh, if something was completed way back in, January and you have to turn in everything to the state in December, like there's a lot of life that happens between January and December, right? So you want to make sure that you've got all of your documentation put somewhere that shows that it was done. That way you don't have to go digging frantically the day before your assessment is due to the state, right? Lots of ways that agencies do this. You have, there's not one right answer. There's a right answer for your agency. Our central filing system can be very helpful. So something like a SharePoint site where when the standard is done, the person, whoever has done that, needs to upload their documentation there and save it there. That way, when you go to assess, it's all right there. Or you send an email with the documentation to a specific email address that you have as an agency. Or, some folks still use paper, and that's okay. You have a specific binder that it all goes into. So just make sure that you're doing it as it happens. And then also, kind of going back into that idea of standard operating procedures, make sure that your agency is documenting how you go about documenting your org standards and managing your org standards in some kind of centralized way, right? That way, again, in case you're the person who's kind of, the herder of cats on this, that if, for some reason you weren't in the office, you won the lottery, somebody else would know how to effectively herd the cats and make sure that the requirements are met. I think it's very common that when there is transition in an agency, that's when we have standards that are missed because folks just don't know all of the requirements or how it was done. So, think about yourself, think about how it felt maybe when you came in and what would have been helpful for you to know. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be a Word document with all of this stuff written down into it, right? Just make sure you've got it written down some way. That way that knowledge can be transferred to others in your organization. Also, then, do not recommend that you wait for the state to assess how you are doing. You should be assessing yourself on a regular basis to see how are we are we meeting the requirements of the standards on an ongoing basis? And so one thing to do is, as some of like your key deliverables or documents are completed, have a checklist that says, here's what the requirements are for community assessment, right? And before that thing is finalized and approved by the board, you have gone through that checklist and you have made sure that everything is done there. Because once that book is closed, right, once you've approved your community assessment, it might be challenging. It will be more challenging to go back and try to add something in that you missed initially. Same thing for your strategic plan, right? There's a lot of requirements for strategic plans. Make sure that your planning document, when it's done, has everything you need in there. Same with your community action plan. We already talked about a centralized managing filing system. And then back to that same point, people in organizations turn over on a regular basis. By using a team-based approach, you're going to build your capacity so that if anybody is out, someone else can step in, someone else has at least some knowledge to be able to pick up the ball and keep running. And then a couple of tips for evaluating the org standards and kind of how you're doing. It's really great if every year you could choose 1 or 2 categories where you just want to go a little bit deeper and not just look at, uh, uh, did we meet the standard? Did we not meet the standard? But what's the best practice here, right? What's the best practice when it comes to boards? What's the best practice when it comes to some of our HR stuff, right? Do some deeper learning and be, sharpening your own axe so that you can be a stronger organization. Also, benchmark how you're doing over time across standards. Really nice if you have a spreadsheet that says, year over year, every standard and if it was met or not met. And then you can look for a pattern, right? Are there certain standards that we are missing year after year? Which, by the way, is something that state offices, when they're assessing org standards, they are looking for that. They are looking for a pattern of non-compliance. Sometimes there's a common root behind why certain standards might be missed, even across categories. I'll give you a hint. One of the reasons that we see standards are frequently missed is actually particularly with standards that have to go before the board of directors and have to be approved by something has to be approved by the board of directors, something has to be received by, the board has to take specific action. And the reason that those standards are frequently missed actually has to do with documentation in the meeting minutes. So make sure that whoever is taking your minutes for your board meeting, that they know if there are specific things that are going to happen at a board meeting that will need to be in the board meeting minutes in a certain way, right? We do have some great tools and resources available to kind of help you with this. There's a great tool on board meeting minute templates that we put together with CapLaw that can help you out. As soon as I stop talking, I'll put that in the chat for you, or it may be here in our PowerPoint as well. But here's the other thing is that if you see like where you're consistently missing something, make the recommendation for what you might need to do different, to be able to meet those standards in the future. And by the way, your state might also have resources that are available to you, financial resources, training resources for you to be able to leverage for technical assistance or funding for technical assistance to help you grow your own capacity, right? So like if you're having a real struggle with maybe some of the data and analysis things, well, maybe your agency needs some additional training on that. That's a request that you could make of your state offices. Hey, this is something we're really struggling with and something that we need. In some cases, states can procure that training for you. In some cases, there might be special funds that you can apply for in order to allow you to access additional tools, additional training to grow your capacity. So I don't see any questions in the chat. I don't see any questions in the Q&A right now. But now, guys, is a really good time to be putting those things in as we're going. Don't leave, because I still have, some great tools and resources I want you to be aware of. These things are very instrumental in helping you to meet the standards on an ongoing basis. So one of the first places I would recommend that you check out to learn more about the org standards is the partnerships website. If you go onto our website, you see communityactionpartnership.com, and then up there in that programs and initiatives tab, you will see the CSBG Organizational Standards. And if you click that, you'll come to a landing page that has, I think, almost every one of the tools and resources I'm about to share with you right now. So I'm just going to put that into the chat for you so you can follow along. So one of the things that you will find here, you're going to find some tools to help you with assessing how you're doing with the standards. There are separate tools for states and for community action agencies. So again, if you're a state office on this call, you are welcome to use our tool to help you with assessment. And then we do also have lots of guidance about the standards and what they, what some of the intent is behind them. More on that in a second. One of the other tools that you can use is we do have a glossary of terms. Sometimes when you read some of the language in the org standards, you might go, I'm not sure what that means. That's where the glossary comes in. Go ahead and use that to make sure that you understand what everything is. Also, then there are standards. There are some things that are like, you have to do this every year. Some things you have to do every 3 years. Some things you have to do every 5 years. Like there's a lot of dates that you kind of have to keep track of. So our calendar of required actions takes the standards and breaks them out by those different timelines. So if you want to see what has to be done annually, what has to be done every 2 years, 3 years, yada, yada, you can use this tool to kind of see that in one place. And you, again, will find that on the website that I just put into the chat for everybody. Okay. One of the standards that we get questions about frequently is standard 4.3. This is about, using a certified Roma trainer, implementer, advocate, professional to assist with the implementation of your strategic plan, your CAP plan, your community assessment, all that kind of good stuff. This tool will help you with documenting what's required for 4.3. Some states have other requirements as well. So, use our tool if it helps you, but also do check with your state to make sure that there's not other documentation that they are expecting. I was just talking about timelines a minute ago. For boards, that can also get very complicated, that all of the timing of things that have to go before the board. So you can use our calendar board of actions to kind of help you keep track of when things have to be done with your board. And then, as I mentioned, excuse me, for every category, we do have kind of in-depth guidance that gives you information about what the standard says, what the intent of the standard is, and then some of the common documentation that we see that has been helpful for agencies and for states to assess if a standard is met or not met. In addition to that, we also have technical assistance guides. These can help you with that going deeper piece, not just checking the box, but living fully into the intent of the standard. So make sure you check out these technical assistance guides. They'll tell you how to go beyond compliance. We have lots and lots and lots of webinars that we've done over the years on org standards and everything else. So make sure that you check those out on our website. Oh, and then one other thing I wanted to make sure I shared with you is that obviously in this session, we couldn't, in 45 minutes, we don't have time to go deep into what the standards say or what you have to do. We are going to be hosting some upcoming training on the org standards. So we're going to have a skill builder training. We have a virtual session next week that'll take place over September 10th and 11th. There's still a few spots available for that if you'd like to sign up. Again, this is on our website. You can scan the QR code and sign up, all that good stuff. We also will have an in-person training. For anyone who's in Tennessee, we will be, or in the surrounding area, we're going to be in Nashville, Tennessee, November 14th and 15th. That'll be an in-person session. It's about a day and a half of training, hands-on training with other community action friends about the org standards. It's going to be a great training. It'll be, believe it or not, it'll be a lot of fun. We'll have a great time talking org standards. So that is the end of what I had prepared for us today. And I see, Melisha, I see your question in the chat, and I will look to see if I can locate that just as soon as we are done here. Oh, I see it right there. So I am happy to send that or put that into the chat here. It's under assessment tools. And so I put that in the chat for you. I hope that helps. Do folks have any other questions or comments or thoughts? General accolades? If not, I want to thank everybody. Oh, I see. My chats are just going to me. So how about if I put that here for everybody first? There we go. There's that. And I apologize. My earlier link didn't go to everybody. My apologies. We'll put that here. And then I have one more link for you. We'd love to know how this went, how you thought the webinar was. Take our webinar evaluation. Let us know your thoughts. Guys, if you ever have thoughts or questions about the org standards, you can reach out to me. Always happy to talk org standards. You can also reach out to my colleague, Terry Bearden. Also, another person who's always very happy to talk org standards. Probably the only two people in the world who are always happy to talk org standards are me and Terry. So with that, I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you for your time. Oh, I see one question. What is the best resource for CSBG policies and procedures? That's a good question. I don't know of a single resource that would dive into CSBG policies and procedures. And this is a space where I might look to my state association first, because also different states might have different rules about CSBG and kind of requirements. And so I might start with my state association. And if they don't have kind of a tool, they might be able to help you ask your peers for examples of what their policies and procedures look like. Sometimes just seeing what other people are doing is helpful. And getting kind of an idea for what it can look like. So sorry, I don't have a ready-made template for that, but hope that that answer helps. Okay, with that, for real this time, y'all. Thank you so much for your time. Looking forward to seeing some of you in Tennessee, and maybe next week virtually. So with that, we'll say have a great day. Take care.